Nearly 120 years ago, May 20th, 1856, U.S. Senator Charles Sumner gave a speech fiercely condemning slavery and the proponents of slavery. 2 days later, the cousin of one of the defenders of slavery he attacked, Preston Brooks, a representative from South Carolina, beat him fiercely on the floor of the Senate, to the point that he was unable to return to work for 3 years, during which Massachusetts kept him in the seat as a reproach to the slaveholding South. The slaveholding South saw no problem with this behavior, thought Brooks was fully justified, and you had people sending Brooks, who had broken his cane beating Sumner, from all over the South, sending him new canes, saying, "Beat him again." Brooks had debated, should I challenge Sumner to a duel, and concluded, debating this man is beneath my dignity. The only way to respond is violence. Which, even at the time, in the lead-up to the U.S. Civil War, which was a pretty violent phase in U.S. history, was an aberration, part of what makes it so memorable. But I'm not interested in talking about the specific act of violence so much as this attitude of Brooks thinking Sumner's arguments were beneath responding to except with force. And obviously, we don't tend to respond to arguments with force, fortunately, in our society, but we do. That underlying attitude of some people, some arguments are beneath my contempt is still alive and well, especially not so much the establishment elites, but like the midwit, the symbolic capitalist defenders of the elites. And I've been thinking about that in terms of books. In a previous video, which I'm going to do another follow-up on, I talked about how Francis Fukuyama and Steven Pinker, they're fierce defenders of the establishment overall, and optimists, but they're slightly too critical. And the establishment really hate Pinker and Fukuyama. With Fukuyama, they like to sort of misrepresent him the whole end of history, which I still haven't read, but I know enough about what was in it to know that the end of history wasn't saying history is over. He's saying that history is at a point where only liberal democracy is a viable system, which I still think is questionable, but it's not what people criticize him on. And then Pinker, just the establishment gets angry about him. And I've seen it too with other people who you would think shouldn't be that controversial for the kinds of people who get mad about it. So I've mentioned, in fact, I made a whole video, it was one of my first 5 videos that I made, though it came out much later, on Jared Diamond and the contempt the establishment has for guns, germs, and steel, or at least academic historians have for this book, even though he was defending the establishment position that should be the core point, which is that the success of Europe in conquering the world wasn't about racial superiority, which was making a comeback at the time. And yet academic historians felt he was encroaching on their territory, getting details wrong, they got very mad. They still get mad about this book. And likewise, David Graeber is an anti-establishment leftist who I have multiple times seen defenders of the establishment groan, "Oh God, you like David Graeber," like that's an argument against his actual thinking. And I will admit, a lot of David Graeber's fans are kind of, how do I put this politely, kind of brain-rotted. But that isn't an argument against Graeber himself, and to some degree, I think you can look at the fans of an author to say, if this is who this is useful for, this might not be useful to me. But also judging Graeber's work on the basis of his fans being sort of obnoxious tankies, that's not an argument, that's just a groan. And you see this too with, so I mentioned Thomas Sowell, who, so I've been calling him Thomas Sowell because that's what people on BreadTube, which is left-wing political YouTube, called him. And some of my commentators informed me this is basically, I was repeating the equivalent of like when Republicans say Democrat Party, where they were calling him this as a means of making him sound worse. His real name is Sowell, so very petty thing that I don't agree with, but I fell for. Anyways, Thomas Sowell, now that I've read him, I realize, oh, he is actually really insightful, and yet I still get people in my comments on those videos saying, oh, he's an idiot, like I can't, of course you're a Thomas Sowell reader, I can't believe you read someone like Thomas Sowell, depending on their opinion of me. And similar thing with self-help books, in particular, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, where you have sort of a contempt for just this kind of literature, which, having read it, I'm like, there is a reason this is one of the best-selling self-help books of all time. And so I've been thinking about this, because basically this is just people who sort of groan and say, oh, I can't believe you like this writer, or ugh, this again, and don't actually make arguments. Generally, they themselves don't have or don't know the arguments for why the establishment doesn't like these writers, which are generally not serious criticisms. They are turf wars. They often do get minor facts wrong, but as I said in my video on debunking, everybody gets facts wrong, and a lot of these debunkings, most of them from what I've seen, are just, they are going against what the establishment narrative in often some academic department believes about these facts, instead of actually something that I would say is verifiably wrong as a fact. And I've been thinking about this because, first of all, this argument can and does work. I have mentioned before, I had binge eating disorder most of my life, but I was never more than 40 pounds overweight until I decided to try to eat healthier, which I did by trying to replace all the meat and cheese I was eating with starch, with carbohydrates. And of course, I was in a bad place, which is why I was not trusting my own instincts on what to eat, and also why I was not weighing myself to see what was happening, and I gained an extra 180 pounds doing that. And I've had multiple people ask me, wait, you really believe that bread and rice were healthy? And I was like, yes, I did, because that is what the establishment was telling me, and because I'd grown up with just this whole, so many fad diet. And it turns out most of these fad diets actually do similar things of reducing carbohydrates, or at least reducing glycemic load. And they work for the same underlying reason. That's probably been the most obvious, clearest way that has harmed me. Depression, similar story, but I won't get into that one. I'll get into that deeper in another time. And so I've had to learn, first of all, don't take these people seriously, because it is stopping me from reading people I might genuinely benefit from reading. But then I still have people like Thomas Sowell, who I internalized that so much that I have to actively go against it. And I'm in a phase now where I am, if I recognize there is a writer where my reaction is, oh God, I don't want to read this, I have been forcing myself to evaluate, should I, in this case, actually read that? And I'll have more on that. But I've been thinking also about the nature of this argument, this this again argument, which basically this idea, this person is beneath my contempt to even respond to, because they've been debunked so many times. And the debunking is usually, at best, they got a few facts wrong and then disagreed with the establishment in some field on a lot of facts that are very open to interpretation, and then prioritize different things. But there's just this division, this gap, and it's signaling tribal membership for the person doing it. It's signaling what Pierre Bourdieu called cultural capital, which I mentioned from Musa Al-Harbi's We've Never Been Woke. And I'm going to read Bourdieu. I started actually reading one of his books, but going through that slowly. And I've been thinking about the people who make this argument, because I try not to do stuff like this, and I've always tried not to, and I will have reactions to people where I have that reaction if I'm talking about someone, some idea, but it's generally, I'm not going out of my way to be like, oh, just this person, without going further into what I think. And I'm thinking about, when I was in undergrad, I had two professors. I was into two very geeky hobbies, which were conlanging, creating artificial languages, and alternate history. And this was back before you had the whole YouTube community of alternate history, so I was posting back on soc.hist.whatif. But one of my linguistics professors, well, I didn't take linguistics from him, but professor in the School of Cognitive Science, was very anti-conlang, because he's like, you could be devoting this language to learning real endangered languages. And the thing is, people who do conlangs often try to learn about languages that people aren't learning, but if they weren't doing this, they're not going to be learning and preserving endangered languages. And if they were, that would come up for criticism too, because now you have a bunch of middle-class white people trying to learn and dominate languages of poor indigenous people, right? And then a professor who actually did an independent study with me in writing, he was great, Will Ryan, if anyone went to Hampshire College. He was also a family friend of someone who was almost like a third parent to me. But he was really anti-alternate history for, I'm not entirely sure why. He just thought it's not serious, it's not worth considering. And he sort of groaned when I said I'm into it, but he was also like, but yeah, I mean, if you like that, you like that. I'm not going to agree to do any of that in the independent study, because I had one story I was thinking of, and it's like, yeah, you can do science fiction, but not alternate history. I don't want to. And I'm like, okay, he has that bias, and that's fine. But both of these people they had this reaction, but they were clear about what they didn't like, that it was a them thing, and they weren't going out of their way to promote it. And of course, I'm seeing in my comments now people reacting mostly to some books that I've read, but also sometimes to me just, I can't believe either this has been debunked or you're such an idiot. Basically, I'm realizing the people who do this, I've talked about status games versus positive sum games, Naval Ravikant, Almanac of Naval Ravikant, he talks about that, and then I realized, oh yeah, I see this a lot. The people who are doing this, they are fighting, crusading to defend the cause that they believe in, believe they're signaling cultural capital, but it's about them, but it also works. at least if you're not aware of what's happening. As I said, it worked on me most notably with the dietary stuff. I would have, if I hadn't tried to eat healthier according to what I'd been taught by a lot of, ugh, I can't believe these bad diets, I would have been at most 40 pounds overweight. So, and I've other areas where that's kept me back too, but that is the most prominent one for me. And so I think it's worth being aware of when you see people doing this, especially when they're coming into comment sections or Reddit threads and responding to what you're saying with ugh, they're inserting themselves into the conversation. These are people, they're playing status games to signal, hey, I have the cultural capital to know that in this community I come from, these people are beneath contempt. And once you know that, once you see it, you can just say, okay, yeah, you're a midwit, and I'm not taking anything you have to say seriously. So I wanted to talk about that as sort of a foundation for other stuff I'm going to talk about. Just ugh is not an argument, and yet it's very effective because it's appealing to our emotions, because as social primates, we want to be in the in-group, both in terms of we want to fit in, and in terms of historically doing what everybody else was doing would lead to survival. But in our very atomized society where a lot of people do not have, as Nassim Nicholas Taleb would put it, skin in the game, it becomes easy to sort of do this where either you're not following, you're still doing a lot of the things that people who could benefit from this from. So like Stephen Covey, for example, he is giving advice that is useful to people who would not have this advice, but the people who are doing it have often learned from other sources. And in my video criticizing Ben Shapiro, most of the comments were condemning me for my opinion of Jordan Peterson improving somewhat. I still not an admirer of Peterson, especially where he's gone now. I no longer have as complete contempt as I used to have for him because I got my information about Jordan Peterson from people on the establishment and sometimes anti-establishment, people on the left. And Jordan Peterson has helped a lot of people. Even if his advice is imperfect, he's presented in a way that's helped them. Likewise, Dave Ramsey, his advice is not the best financial advice, strictly speaking, but it's advice that takes human nature into account, and it works for a lot of people. And yet this ugh argument can, at least for people who are on the fence or who try to be conformist, be effective if you don't know what's going on. So wanted to make this video calling this out, and I'll have more to say about it in the future. Thanks for watching. I'm Magpie. This is Leela, and I'll see y'all in the next one.